Hi, my name's Dylan Toe. I'm a landscape photographer from South Australia, Adelaide in particular, and we have some beautiful weather here in Adelaide, and as well as being surrounded by coastline. So it all makes sense that the main genre of landscape photography that I tend to shoot is seascape photography. I'm also a global ambassador for NiSi filters, and so for today we're going to be focusing on shooting landscapes with the 15mm f4 NiSi lens, which I have attached to my Canon R5. So before we go out into the field, I just thought I'd give a brief explanation of where we're going to go and how we're going to plan this shoot. So I've got a few things on screen to show you. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to be visiting Hallett Cove Beach. And Hallett Cove Beach faces west, and we're going out at sunset tonight. So there's a bit of cloud in the sky, but hopefully there may be a break in the clouds to allow a little bit of light to come through for some color. The next thing I tend to do is, when I'm shooting seascapes, is look at the tide times, and it's a bit daunting. Tonight's a 2.3 meter high tide, but there are some rocks there that are pretty much on the high tide line that I'm hoping to shoot while we're there, submerged in water. So I'll only be able to tell when I get there as to how feasible that plan is and whether we have to adapt. In terms of how I'm planning the weather, this is a not very good kind of cloud forecast, unfortunately. There's a lot of low cloud around the skies, but hopefully you can see it's quite patchy. And if we go through scrolling back and forth, there may be some breaks in light there that gives a break in the color, so it's not just all gray. But even if it is, I'm sure we can come up with something. All right, so when I'm shooting seascapes, there's a certain prerequisite equipment that we need. The first is on the camera itself. Other than the lens, I tend to shoot with an L bracket so that I can switch to a vertical composition anytime very quickly. The other thing is that when I'm shooting in the seascape, I need to protect myself and the camera. Often I find something like a neck warmer or a beanie over the camera is all that's needed just to prevent the splash getting onto the camera and soaking straight in. But the R5 is pretty weather resistant, so I'm pretty happy not to have too much weather resistance that impedes your ability to do composition. I also bring some waterproofs, which I think are essential to keep myself warm because I tend to get pretty cold pretty easily and I can't shoot any further. And in wet rocky environments, I also bring these along to help me grip onto rocks, so that I don't slip. And it's also a bit of a safety equipment there. When you're shooting seascapes, you're often shooting long exposures, so a tripod that's got attachable and movable legs so that it can go as flat as possible is very desirable, so you can control the perspective as well as easily movable legs, and make sure you clean it afterwards as well. And lastly, being a filter ambassador, you can't forget the filter kit. So in here, I won't show you all the filters, but I'm carrying a 3-stop, a 6-stop and a 10-stop ND filter, as well as some GNDs to try and control the exposure. And when we get to the scene, today's a bit of a grey light scene, so I probably won't need to go beyond the 6-stop, but I have everything here just in case, and it sits around my waist with a belt. All right, so we're going to go through how I use the NiSi 15mm f4 lens. It's a manual lens. So on this first row of numbers here, that indicates the aperture that you'll be shooting at. And for landscape photography and seascapes in particular, I'm usually shooting between f11 and f16. So I'll put it somewhere in that regard there. Now this next row up here is the focus ring. And you see the numbers up here. If we go to, let's say, f16 where I'm shooting, then if you put the infinity at f16, that says that there'll be acceptable sharpness up to infinity. Now I find that in practice, I move it past infinity quite a fair way, and that gives me the sharpest results. And at the other end, at the closest end, it means that I can still have objects within 0.3 to 0.4 of a meter, and that'll still be an acceptable focus. So that's my compromise, and once I have this set up there, I don't need to touch the setup at all, apart from if I need to adjust the aperture to get more or less light in, depending on the prevailing conditions. So that's a summary of how to use focus with any kind of manual lens, in particular this f4 15mm lens. All right, let's go. Voicing over due to blustery conditions. So as we're walking out, you can see the tide was very high, and I've spotted 2 rock formations with potential leading lines into the sun, and so we're just checking both of them out. Here I'm looking at potential compositions with receding water around the small pebbles in the foreground, as well as potential wave patterns around the larger rocks in the distance, which I hope will be illuminated by the setting sun. And over in the distance there are some larger rock formations which appear stacked against each other, which I'd also like to photograph later in the evening. So early in the shoot I like to get my feet wet just so I get used to the temperature and the conditions. I'm hoping to shoot with these foreground rocks with the waves receding, with the stacked rocks in the background shooting perpendicular to the sun. So in my setup, I strap my filters and accessories to my waist while keep my wipes and blowing material in a jacket pocket. So the 15mm NiSi takes a 72 adapter ring, which fits onto the 82mm main ring, and the main ring contains a circular polarizer, which I'll need to use with caution given that one of my planned compositions with those stacks is perpendicular to the sun, which may lead to banding in the sky if I'm not careful. So currently my favourite filter holder is the NiSi switch filter holder, which fits 2 filters and allows them to independently move within each other. So I lock it on for safety and we're good to go. Here I'm demonstrating that for larger droplets, a blower is the most effective way to keep the glass clean, but for smaller droplets, paper wipes such as Kim wipes result in minimal smearing when you wipe across the glass surface. Just finished shooting the sunset and now it's post-dusk hues. Unfortunately there's a big bank of cloud on the horizon, so we haven't had the post-sunset hues that you normally get. But I was shooting this location from about 45 minutes before sunset, and at that point in time there was golden light shining on all the rocks here. So the whole point of using this setup is that, you see all these rocks here, this tripod can be very unsteady when you first put it down, but when you put it in and let it set for a bit and it'll settle into the sand, then you can take a few shots without getting shutter shake. The other thing that's important with seascape photography is the perspective. So if you shoot point down, that kind of exaggerates depth into the field, and in the ocean here I've got no vertical lines to worry about trees and things diverging out. So if you're shooting in a forest, that's not something you should be doing. But shooting at the sea, you can certainly get away with it, and you can certainly make clouds kind of expand out. Now, you might notice I've got a few things set up on here. The first is this kind of headscarf, and all that does is when there's big waves coming, it prevents a deluge of water going in, and that's what I found kills cameras the most often rather than sea spray. So that's one aspect of the safety thing. I've got a whole lot of filters set up. This was the entire filter set I was setting up with, so the switch filter so I could move it at any time. And at the front here, what I've got is a medium GND, and inside there on the first slot, I've got a 6-stop GND for a couple of very long exposures in excess of a minute or 2 minutes that I took during the scene. But because of how dynamic this all was,
I found that the shutter speed that worked best was about 0.3 to 0.5 a second, and I had to do some exposure blending to make sure that the sky was properly exposed even with the 3-stop GND there. Now the other advantage of this setup as well with the 15mm is that it's quite vastly different what you get with a horizontal versus a vertical shot, and you really don't want to be messing around with your tripod changing position, so the L plate really lets you do that in one single motion. And that's why I love shooting a seascapes and landscapes with an L plate, so that it makes you transition easily without mucking around with the stability of your setup. Where the camera's pointed behind me was where a lot of pinks happen, and unfortunately I couldn't go in the water to get those pinks, so I opted for composition instead of color. And it's often a difficult choice you have to make when you're in the field. Do you stick with the composition that you've set up, or do you go chasing light? And on a day like today, I definitely chose to go for composition because the light was fairly dramatic, even shooting into the sun as well. So that's all from me today, and hopefully the results of the various shots that I took at shutter speeds, orientation, apertures and ISOs, hopefully they all come together in a good end result. So thank you very much, and on behalf of NiSi for letting me use this 15mm lens, hopefully we'll get some good results. So with this final image here, the aim was to get a pattern of wave motion that was an S pattern heading towards the sun, and the GND that I was using helped to balance out the exposures. But despite this, I still needed an extra exposure for the sky to blend everything in. So the foreground is actually entirely one shot, and there's a second exposure for the sky which are blended together. The shutter speed in this image was half a second to capture the receding waves, creating that S pattern. The second image was of my alternative composition, with the foreground rocks really submerged with the receding waves, and you can see those stacks in the background which are more accessible during low tide. But this occurred shortly before sunset. Unfortunately, that thick band of cloud you see on the horizon obscured any pink light that may have happened later, but there was some moments of color, and I turned the polarizer so there wouldn't be a band in the sky, and also so that there would be some reflections of that foreground rock on the bottom right. The shutter speed for this image was also in the realm of a third to a half a second, which gives you that nice retention of texture, yet a sense of motion with that as well.